that's to let everybody know it's started. And I have already mentioned you can enable the caption from the menu. And also, please keep yourself muted during the presentation. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and so you can use your hand raise emoji or just speak up if you have any questions. You can also use the chat function too. So with that done, let's get things moving along. Today's talk is titled Starry Night and Sunflowers, the Genius of Vincent Van Gogh, the life, work, and tragic death of one of the world's most beloved artists and myself. He's one of my favorite artists too. And so we're so very lucky to have Jane Oneail here as the speaker. Jane is the founder of Culturally Curious. It's an arts education consulting firm specializing in art appreciation programs. So she curates and delivers programs throughout New England and beyond. Oneail holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from Harvard University. Jane is born and raised in New Hampshire. She has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane has also taught at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. And so if you want to find out more, you can find her information at iamculturallycurious.com, which I will also put in the chat. So at that, I am going to turn it over to Jane.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your day today to learn a little bit more about Vincent Van Gogh. I can promise you, this is time well spent. Whenever you're looking at Vincent Van Gogh's paintings, I feel like, I don't know, there's just this incredible renewal, the sense of restoration in your soul when you look at these works. Vincent's life story is so moving and so powerful, and we're going to be delving into all of it tonight. So let me give you a sense in terms of how we're going to spend the next 50 minutes or so together. We're going to start off with an introduction to the artist, and of course we'll be getting back to Starry Nights that we saw in the previous slide. Here we see him in a self-portrait towards the end of his short life. This is painted in 1889. It's at the Musée d'Orsay. Look at how sort of tight and restricted his body looks and how pinched his expression is. And yet there's this free-flowing, cloudy airiness around him. I always felt like this was such a mismatch between demeanor and background. After we get to know Vincent Van Gogh a little bit better, we'll turn our attention to Postimpressionism. He is referred to as a post-impressionist artist, but that term didn't even exist while he was alive. So we'll get a better understanding about what that really means and take a look at some of his artistic influences. And then instead of just working through a basic chronology of his life, I've divided this up into different subjects that he was drawn to in terms of his painting. And then I got to keep you here right till the end so that we can get the famous story of the ear and the alternative story too, which I find very compelling. All right, so lots to cover. Let's dive right in with an introduction to the artist. We've got another self-portrait of him here. This one is from just a few years earlier, 1887. Now, Vincent van Gogh was a Dutch artist, but he spent a great deal of his time in France. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce his name in the Dutch way or the French way. We're just going to say it the American way, which is just Vincent van Gogh. He was born right around mid-century and he dies at the early tragic age of 37. Like I said, he was a post-impressionist painter. We'll be diving into that a little bit more. Now, a fun fact about him is that he was not commercially successful. I think a lot of people have this general sense that he was a little bit of an artistic failure during his lifetime because he didn't sell any works of art. He did, in fact, sell one painting. This is it right here. It's certainly not anyone's favorite Van Gogh painting. It's called Red Vineyard from 1888. He actually sold it to a friend. It was a good payday for him, though. It was the equivalent of about $2,000 in today's money. But he was prolific during his lifetime. His career as a painter really only spanned about 10 years. And And during that time, he produced about 900 oil paintings and about 1,100 works on paper. So that is, just to give you a sense, that is more, that's a higher rate of production than artists that live into their 70s, most artists that live into their 70s. So extremely productive as an artist. And we'll talk a little bit about how that played into his mental illness or helped to sort of stave it off. Now, another important element to Vincent Van Gogh's biography is that he lived most of his life in poverty. I mean, he was born to middle-class parents, but he opted for a very sort of austere lifestyle. In fact, before he became a painter, he was serving as a missionary, and he famously decided to give up the lodgings that were kind of given to him as a missionary, and instead he slept essentially in a barn so that the poor could have his lodging. Now, this is his famous painting of his bedroom from 1889. It's one of several editions of this painting, but you can see with this image, all these hallmarks that are just so essential to Van Gogh. But what I wanted to emphasize here is just how simply he lived. I mean, there's only just a few essential elements on the table here, a few hooks for his clothes, some images on the wall, but otherwise he had essentially a monastic lifestyle, and that suited him just fine. All right, so just a few last big ideas when it comes to Vincent Van Gogh. He sadly was lonely for a great deal of his life. He did actually propose to several different women. He proposed to 3 of them in total, rejected by all of them. His only requited love was really his artwork, but he did spend a great deal of time in the company of prostitutes, although even then he kind of felt like he didn't measure up, so to speak. During his lifetime, he was seen as a failure. He was seen as a madman. He likely had manic depression, maybe epilepsy, maybe schizophrenia, but we obviously can't diagnose him today. We do know that he was diagnosed with gonorrhea and probably had syphilis. So the other contributing factors to his mental state were really the way he took care of himself. Vincent Van Gogh rarely ate. He drank quite a bit. In this portrait of him by a fellow post-impressionist Toulouse-Lautrec, we can see Vincent Van Gogh sitting in front of a glass of absinthe here, which is a very strong liqueur that had hallucinogenic properties. In addition to rarely eating, drinking quite a bit, he smoked, and during particular manic episodes, he would actually ingest paint and paint thinner. So you'll see a real transformation in his body, in the way he looks in this decade in which he's working. This portrait of him, I just find so powerful, because he and the artist here, he and Toulouse-Lautrec, they weren't exactly chums, but here he is posing for him and turning as far away as possible to still be portrayed and recognized here. Now, there are very few photographs of Vincent Van Gogh that have been authenticated. Believe it or not, this is him over here on the left. He was about 19 years old when this photograph was taken. And like I said, we're going to see a dramatic transformation over the course of the evening. This is his brother. His brother's name, I'm again going to give it the American pronunciation here, Theo. And his brother had played an immensely important role in Vincent Van Gogh's life. Here, these photographs were taken when the brothers were working for essentially a dealer, for an art dealer. And Vincent Van Gogh only worked there for a brief time, but his brother was employed there for much of his adult life. Now, when it came to this close relationship between the brothers, Theo oftentimes supported his brother emotionally, financially, and they kept in touch, whether they were in the same town or across the continent from each other. Now, Vincent Van Gogh never kept a scrap of paper that his brother sent to him, but his brother Theo kept everything. Hundreds of pages of letters. And these letters together, I mean, they've been published, but they really function as like a diary in terms of where Vincent Van Gogh's head was at. This is a page from a letter from 1882. This is from 1890. It's sort of interesting to see his sketches that he includes in these letters and how dramatically they evolve over the course of that decade too. But it gives us a sense in terms of what his intentions were with certain works that he was working on, how he felt about them after they were finished. And so clearly his brother had a great deal of faith in what Vincent Van Gogh was capable of. And that was why he was, essentially documenting his brother's artistic career. So almost everything we know about Vincent Van Gogh really comes by way of his brother. So let's turn our attention now that we have a sense of who Van Gogh was, let's turn our attention now to this term post-impressionism and what this really means when it comes to Vincent Van Gogh. Now, I think most people are familiar with Impressionism, Claude Monet, Renoir, those sorts of artists who are working a couple decades, like a generation really before Vincent Van Gogh in France. And so we have a work by Claude Monet over here on the right side, or sorry, on the left side of the screen. This was done in 1868. It's a classic French Impressionist painting. It was done outside, it was done rapidly, and we have the artist focusing on these almost like momentary effects of light and shadow, particularly on the trunk of the tree over here. But it's a beautiful scene. It's a lovely scene of, just a woman looking at the river here with this lovely boat in the foreground. Now, this was a loose, sort of subjective way to approach painting. And it was a revolution for the time. But a couple of decades later, you have a generation of artists who are really struggling with what to do with it. I mean, is this sketchy approach to art making? Is this something that people are going to be teaching in art schools? So artists like Vincent Van Gogh and others like Georges Seurat, who we see over here on the left, they were trying to find a way to make it Impressionism more permanent, to give it some structure that you could actually teach it, that you could actually create a real style that had some meaning and some substance coming out of Impressionism. So Seurat's answer to this was pointillism. It was to take all of the loose, broken brushwork that we see with Monet over here and just make it tiny little pixelated dots. One of the things that Seurat and other post-impressionists were interested in was color theory. And we'll see that this is something that Vincent Van Gogh is sort of obsessed with. But the color theory here was the thinking that if you place two colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel right next to each other, the way our eyes perceive these colors and blend them together would make the painting that much more alive. It would really sort of make these colors pop. And so you can see Georges Seurat doing this with especially the frame of this painting that he has also painted with this pixelated approach to the application of paint. So you can see there's like a little orangey peach patch of grass right here in the foreground, and he balances it out by placing the opposite color on the color wheel right alongside it in the frame. And he's doing this throughout the painting. And so this is the sort of thing that galvanizes artists like Vincent Van Gogh as well. So now we have a comparison between the Impressionist work on the left, also by Monet, and the post-impressionist work by Vincent Van Gogh on the right. These works are separated out only by about a decade and a half. Now, Monet would rapidly apply paint to his canvas. He was executing pictures in the space of a few hours, working outside, really trying to capture momentary effects of light and shadow. But for the most part, his paintings didn't have black in them. They were really sort of bright color palettes. And that's something that the post-impressionists sort of hang their hats on as well. Usually, for the most part, it's very bright, vivid colors, but they're spending a lot more time with their compositions and with the application of paint. I want to draw your attention to the fact that in Vincent Van Gogh's painting, he is literally changing his brushstroke according to the color that he's laying down. And I think you can specifically see it in these like little, almost like maroon or fuchsia dashes of color that are leading us down this garden path over here. And then you'll notice, you know, the cypress trees in the background, the irises here in the middle ground. Everything is variated based on the color that he is applying. So this is something that is much more methodical. And this is what the post-impressionists were really trying to achieve. Now, whether you were an impressionist or a post-impressionist, all of these artists are very interested in Japanese art, and it has a huge influence on what they're doing. So we have a Japanese woodblock print over here on the left. We have Monet's answer to this. Many of you have probably seen it. It's a work at the MFA in Boston. This is Madame Monet dressed in a Japanese kimono with all of these fans surrounding her. And Vincent Van Gogh was just as taken with Japanese art as the rest of the Impressionists. In fact, he essentially wallpapered every room he ever lived in with cheap Japanese prints that were pretty easy for him to access. So by the time he's painting this picture of the almond blossoms in the final year of his life, this was a painting for his newborn nephew named after him. You can see the direct influence of Japanese printmaking, this idea of tree branches sort of stretching out in front of a monochromatic background, sort of existing in this other plane that seems really separate from the natural world around us, at least to Western eyes. So that Japanese influence is complete. I'll be pointing it out throughout the program. One last element for us to consider in terms of an influence for Vincent Van Gogh. It was also an influence for a lot of Impressionist artists, and that is alcohol. So over here on the left, we have a famous painting by the Impressionist Edgar Degas. It's called The Absinthe, or The Absinthe Drinkers. And we can see two individuals over here, can't quite tell if they're together, but they are just in a drunken stupor out at a cafe, presumably in Paris. On the right over here, we have Vincent Van Gogh's famous Night Cafe. We're so lucky that this is in the United States. It's down at Yale University Art Gallery, painted in 1888. And here, Vincent Van Gogh was presumably drinking his own absinthe, but he's showing us a similar scene, a shady scene that's happening after midnight in a cafe that's illuminated by this brilliant light, this sort of garish light in this case. And Vincent Van Gogh wrote to his brother about how the color combinations here, the yellows, this orangey red, and that lime green, were colors that were specifically chosen because together they could make you feel like going mad or committing a crime. There's a very foreboding sense to this night cafe here, and it's certainly all influenced by the drinking. Okay, so let's turn our attention to some of the subjects that Vincent Van Gogh was particularly fond of, especially when he first started out as an artist. So like I said, he had been an art dealer briefly. He had been a missionary briefly. He comes to being an artist when he's about 27 years old, and he is self-taught. Really, he learns by copying. And one of the artists that he was just sort of obsessed with, he couldn't stop copying his work, was a realist artist, a French artist named Jean-Francois Millet. This is a Millet work over here on the left. This is Vincent Van Gogh's interpretation of it. So this work is called The Sower. It dates to 1850. Vincent Van Gogh is doing this work nearly 40 years later. So it's interesting to think that this kind of realist, slightly romanticized farmer, this man who's out sowing seeds, really captivates Vincent van Gogh. He captures the same striding pose, somebody who's moving quickly, presumably down this slope, somebody who is doing the simple, honest work, connected to the land, connected to their own survival. Millet sort of makes this figure a little bit rough, a little bit ugly looking, at least from what we can peer at from behind, from underneath the shadow and caused by the brim of the hat. And similarly, Vincent van Gogh is not trying to make this individual beautiful. Instead, he's focusing on color, and he's focusing on color theory and his brushstrokes. So note again, he's not quite nailed the opposite color in the color wheel, because we're sort of working with that lime green, this sort of bright yellow here in the sky, but he's right in here. He's using these kind of blue violets to describe this landscape. So this is an anti-naturalistic color palette. It really has nothing to do with the observed world, but it's him delving into color theory and finding what are, in the end, really pleasing color choices here. So he goes back to this idea of the sower about 30 different times. He's really attracted to this figure, the idea of this figure sort of striding forward and sowing seeds. And oftentimes, like you see here, it is just an opportunity to explore these anti-naturalistic colors in a natural landscape. He always is attracted to what is happening in the sky. We'll certainly see that in a few moments. Here's yet another sower, and I think you can really see the Japanese influence in this particular painting with the silhouetted figure, this huge glorious sun right behind his head, and a mostly silhouetted tree here, just in the striking diagonal right here in the foreground. So we see all of these elements kind of coming together in his work. Beyond the sower, Vincent van Gogh was really taken by mid-century depictions of peasant women. Now, this is another painting by Jean-Francois Millet. It's a famous painting called The Gleaners. It dates to 1857. It's an amazing picture because prior to Millet, people weren't spending their time painting huge canvases of poor working class people, really the poorest of the poor. The gleaners are the people that go through a field after it's been harvested, and they're picking up the little scraps that have been left behind. It's a subsistence existence, and it is hard, backbreaking labor. Every time I look at these women, I get sympathy back pain. I sit up a little bit straighter, and it's just such a great composition here too, with the red, the blue, and the yellow hat, and this one woman who looks like she's about to stand up, but her head has not yet broken that horizon line. You almost feel the added pressure of the sky weighing down on them, and we can see Vincent van Gogh is painting women in similar positions, and he does it again and again. These are all women who are harvesting potatoes. They are folded over themselves in these difficult, really hard to sustain poses because, I mean, they're not posing for him. They are simply doing the work that is necessary in order to survive. And all of this brings us to Vincent van Gogh's first master work. And it's funny to call it his first master work because at this point, he's already been painting for half of the decade in which he paints. So this is 1885's The Potato Eaters. And if you're thinking, I've never seen this before, don't feel bad. It's not really one of his most celebrated works. And if you're thinking, wow, I don't really like this one, again, don't feel bad. There's a lot about this picture that he made purposely ugly. He actually distorted the faces of the people that we see gathered around this humble meal to make them seem like the salt of the earth, the hardest working people, but the simplicity of their lives and their connectedness to nature makes them good people in this case. Notice there is a little framed picture up here, and it's religious in nature. You can see the cross, and I wouldn't be the first art historian to sort of draw this connection back to the first humble meal, and that is, of course, the Last Supper, where we see Christ and his apostles gathered around a table. breaking bread in a similar way. So he's calling up these references to religious works of art, and certainly tapping into the simplicity and the resulting sort of piety of these individuals here. Now, we'll just wrap up on peasants and farmers with one last copy of a Millet image. And I should say he wasn't sitting in front of these Millet paintings in museum settings. He just saw copies of them and then made his own interpretations. And this one always breaks my heart because it's called First Steps. We see a humble farmer who is laying down his tools, and his wife and his young child are coming through this gate. And the father is opening his arms for this little toddler to take their first steps. Now, I think you'll see throughout this hour and throughout Vincent Van Gogh's life, this was a family dynamic that he dreamed of for himself, and that was never really accessible to him because he wasn't capable of sustaining these kinds of relationships with others. So there's a little bit of heartbreak in here for me when I see Vincent Van Gogh imagining what these first steps might be. But look at this brushwork. It's just beautiful. Okay, so let's turn our attention to still life painting, an area where Vincent Van Gogh truly shines. And he comes from this artistic heritage that really focused on still life painting. As a Dutch artist, he would have been familiar with Dutch traditions in terms of still life. There's very strong Dutch tradition to create these highly realistic, highly detailed still life pictures, oftentimes with a coded religious meaning to them. In addition to that, there's a great Dutch tradition of highly realistic floral still lifes. So these are works that would have been done about 200 years before Vincent Van Gogh was born. These are not the things that he would have been studying most carefully, but they would have been sort of a part of his cultural consciousness. And so even when he is taking his first stab really at some still lifes, you can see he included wooden shoes here. So he is thinking about his Dutch heritage when he's taking his first crack at this. And we see sort of similar shadows over here, but he is no way capturing the kind of realism that we see in these earlier works. So he continues to kind of plod along at still life painting, and he becomes really interested in floral still lifes, in part because it was much easier to buy a bouquet of flowers than it was to pay a model to sit with him. And then you have those personal dynamics at work, which were probably troublesome to him. An early still life painting over here by Vincent Van Gogh is called Vase with Honesty from 1884. This was his first flower painting. And really, I don't think any of us would be writing home about it. We probably wouldn't pay more than $100 to have something like this in our house, but he keeps at it. He keeps buying bouquets of flowers. And for a brief time, he moves in with his brother, and he is getting the kind of emotional and financial support that he has not had since he's been an artist. And all of a sudden, there is color. They're living in Paris together. He's kind of rubbing elbows with the avant-garde in terms of the Parisian art world, and things are sort of coming alive for Vincent Van Gogh. And in addition to that, he is beginning to find his mode of expression. We can really see with these lovely still lifes here that he's really kind of working or even overworking the background in these. Now we begin to see that that really methodical application of paint. There's like a cross hatching happening over here and almost like a rainbow of short brushstrokes above the flowers. And so he's trying to find sort of his voice in the midst of all of this. And then all of a sudden, we get the sunflowers. Every time I see this transition, it gives me goosebumps because he's found his mode of expression here. He has found an artistic solution to the problem that he was trying to solve for years now. Now, these works date from roughly 1887 to 1888. He painted 12 sunflower still lifes in total, and he knew from the second he started painting them that he had found something special. He wrote to his brother The sunflower is mine. He thought of it as an extension of himself, and to him, the yellow here was a communication of gratitude. What an insight into his soul, right? They were also possible because there was new paint colors available in collapsible paint tubes that offered him the opportunity to mix paints to look like this. Now we can certainly see with this central image here, he's really playing with color theory once again, but some of these paintings are just pretty much all yellow and they still really work. Vincent Van Gogh is able to animate every petal, every stem in a way that is just so fascinating and is so perfect for a sunflower too, because we know that they move around over the course of the day when they are still planted in the ground. There is this wonderful dynamic energy to them. Vincent Van Gogh, this is actually a portrait of Vincent Van Gogh painted by his frenemy, Paul Gauguin, while he's in the process of painting one of those sunflower still lifes. So it's sort of, a little sneak peek into his life, into his process. Incidentally, he really didn't like this portrait of him, and he said his friend made him look like a madman. Whether or not he really was is a whole other story. So once he has this solution of the sunflowers, he continues to produce floral still lifes, and some of these still lifes that he produces in the final year of his life really are just absolutely stunning. This is his irises from 1890, the year that he died. There's a lot of color theory happening with this particular picture, and I love how some of them are just kind of spilling out of the vase here. It adds a real kind of visual interest in a place where there wouldn't have been any. And notice too how he is painting every single undulating petal of these irises. Some are in full bloom, there's gorgeous colors, and some are sort of shriveling up here in the middle, but he's found his mode of expression, and it's so gorgeous. There's our color wheel just to remind us, and then we'll end our look at his still lifes with this final work here. I believe this is at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. This was also painted in 1890. Now the colors have sort of faded from this one because these flowers were originally pink. It would have been a great example of his interest in color theory, but this was painted, I believe, right before he was released from the asylum at Saint Remy, and we'll be talking about his stay in the asylum. But there is this sense of freedom with this particular work, and look at the brushwork in the back. There's a looseness here that you don't often see, and maybe even a hopefulness. I love that reading of this particular still life. It's just gorgeous. Let's turn our attention now to Vincent Van Gogh's landscapes. And once again, I would argue that his cultural heritage, his artistic heritage as a Dutch artist, really kind of informed his approach as a painter, at least initially. This is a Dutch Baroque painting. This is actually my hometown museum at the Courier Museum of Art, where we can see this dead tree, this tree trunk that is positioned along the side of a path here. And we also see that there's like this renewal. There's new branches kind of growing forth from it, and a connection to resurrection and salvation at the church in the distance. And Vincent Van Gogh gives us a taste of something sort of similar with this dead tree trunk along the side of the road here, with passersby positioned in the distance. So maybe he's thinking about some of these precedents, but the Impressionists certainly had a huge impact on the way Vincent Van Gogh constructed a painting. Now, this on the left is an Impressionist work by the artist Alfred Sisley. It was painted in 1875, and we see all of that loose Impressionist brushstroke. He's not trying to create a great deal of structure in terms of his methodology, sorry, in terms of how he's applying the paint to the canvas. It's all very loose, it's very free, it's rapidly executed. But when it comes to Vincent van Gogh and the application of paint in a similar view, we can see it's all structure, it's all method. You can almost break it down row by row. He's changing his color, he's changing the way he's applying the paint, whether it's the little stick fence, the prickly bushes here, or just like a smooth patch of grass in the background. He is so careful in the construction of these landscapes. Here's just another gorgeous landscape from Vincent van Gogh. It's called Peach Trees in Blossom. I'm just a sucker for this color blue. I can't get enough of it. This is from 1888. Notice how the blue is in the path in the foreground, and it's sort of dotted throughout the landscape all the way back to the Blue Mountains, and then is applied to the sky in a similar way. It's just stunning. It doesn't really align with our view of the world around us, but it somehow makes looking at the world more magical, doesn't it? He's just got a really special way of depicting things that are familiar to us. Now, once again, I would argue that this French artist, Jean-Francois Millet, had a huge impact in the way Vincent van Gogh painted landscapes. These are two paintings by Millet, and they're dark skies, possibly night skies, but these are skies with something really exceptional happening in that night sky, whether it's like this aura here, I can't even be sure if this is a rainbow or what, after a storm, and then this huge moon hanging over the horizon line. We begin to see Vincent van Gogh's interest in night skies and celestial events beginning in the 1880s. And all of this goes back to color theory as well. There's this wonderful balance between these vivid blue, sort of cobalt blue skies and and the yellow light emanating from these stars. So over here we have Cafe Terrace at night, and then this is called Starry Night over the Rhone. And so we have Vincent van Gogh giving us these little snapshots of life using these remarkable, these very vivid colors that once again don't necessarily align with our lived experience, but they heighten it, they make it more magical. They make this little terrace here the most inviting place ever. We're just drawn to it. They make the reflection of those stars and the gaslight across the river shining on that on the surface of the water just so miraculous. And Vincent van Gogh gives us a little taste of his romantic view by even including a couple down here in the foreground. Now, all of this, of course, leads us to the ultimate solution to landscape painting. Now, this wasn't Vincent van Gogh's initial feeling. He didn't think that this was a successful painting initially. That's what he wrote to his brother. Now, everybody knows this painting. When my son was in preschool, he came home talking to me about Starry Night and Vincent van Gogh. This is a part of all of our cultural heritage now. It's recognizable around the world. So what makes this picture so special? What makes it so famous? I think part of the reason it really became famous is because Vincent van Gogh painted it when he was institutionalized. This was after the whole the incident with his ear that we'll talk about later, but he did spend about a year inside an insane asylum. And we know that he painted this vision while he was there. And I think there was always this fascination that this was the view through, of a madman. This was how he saw the world. And there's something really special in that. But I think we have to be a little bit more grounded in our interpretation. I think this was this wasn't the way he saw the world. This is a constructed way of seeing things. And it is in every sense a construction. This is not what he looked at when he looked out his window at night. In fact, inside the asylum. He had a great deal of freedom. He had a studio, he had his room. And so we know that this is not even what he could see from his room. So it was a setting that he could sort of study during the daytime and compose very thoughtfully. But I think we all love the idea of like these rolling clouds, these stars and planets that have this incredible aura around them. And of course, astrophysicists have studied the celestial layout here, and they've like determined the exact date that this was painted, and which of these are stars and which of these are planets. But for Vincent van Gogh, it was all about the visual experience here, the beautiful auras around those heavenly bodies, around the moon here, and this feeling of like the mist and the clouds moving in over these rolling hills. They almost look like ocean waves in some ways. And then this quaint little town in the foreground. It's sort of our connection into the scene. It walks us into the scene. And the most prominent building here is, of course, the church. It's the only part of that foreground that sort of pierces that night sky there with this impossibly tall steeple. This is not even a record of the church that Vincent van Gogh could see from the asylum. That church actually, in actuality, looked very different. Vincent van Gogh also uses this tall framing device in just this left third of the picture. This is a flame-like cypress tree. Now, cypress trees were often planted in cemeteries, so there's this kind of dark understanding of this as well, connected to his mental illness, connected to the idea of his own death and his struggles here. So there's all this movement in this picture. In fact, I presented it to a number of senior groups over the years that say, this picture sort of pulsates for them. And after a while, it's not very comfortable for them to look at, which I can completely understand. So let's turn our attention now to the way it was painted too. He was using this incredibly thick buildup of paint. It's called an impasto. If you sort of look at it from the side like this, you can see just how thick, almost sculptural, his approach to making this painting is. Incidentally, you can go on MoMA's website. This is owned by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and you can sort of spin the painting around and see it from any angle you'd like to see it from. Now, Vincent van Gogh continued to paint these sort of magnificent scenes with these special happenings in the night sky. This one, again, always breaks my heart. We see a red-headed man with a beard walking alongside this woman in the twilight with this huge moon over their heads. It's a romantic scene that he himself never experienced. Another lovely scene here with this gorgeous aura around this star. So we'll wrap up our look at landscapes, his landscapes, with just a last few when these skies start to get very dark and very foreboding. This is one of my absolute favorites. It's called The Church at Auvers. It's from 1890, just a few weeks before he dies. It's at the Musée d'Orsay. And there's something about this church that makes me feel like it's like a spider that could just kind of get up and walk away. It has so much life to it, doesn't it? But the sky hanging over it is just this incredible color. It is a dark picture, but there is also this incredible light in the foreground. It does seem to be about darkness and salvation at the same time. But Vincent van Gogh's last landscape, and probably one of his most famous, is called Wheat Fields with Crows from 1890. This was painted in the last weeks of his life. Many people consider it his best. We can see he's still applying paint with this sort of method, but we can also see that it's freed up a little bit, that there's this looseness to it. We see a sense of that these wheat fields have just been disturbed and that these crows are all rising up out of it. The sky is darker than ever. We've got all of these diverging paths, and we're thinking about which way Vincent van Gogh is going. Now, some of you may have seen the 1956 movie Lust for Life, starring Kurt Kirk Douglas, where they end Vincent Van Gogh's life in this field as he's painting this picture. I think he's even like attacked by crows in this scene or something. That's not exactly how things end, but we will, of course, be getting to that. We're going to finish up with his interest in portraits and in self-portraits. Now, he had always been interested in faces, beginning with some of those peasants that he started painting in the early 1880s, those darker pictures that had a lot of black and shadow to them. Now, he didn't have really enough sustained relationships to paint a lot of portraits. So the relationships that he did have give us this wonderful insight into his process and his evolution as an artist. These are 3 portraits of a man who owned an art supply store. His name was Père Tanguay, and there's really only a year separating the first from the last here, but we can see kind of a naturalistic depiction of him in 1886, and then over the course of the next year or so, Vincent Van Gogh is using more vivid colors, more thoughtful brushstrokes, really intentional brushstrokes, and these really short dashes of bright color. And we can also see him surrounding Père Tanguay with these Japanese prints that they both loved so much. So this is a great sort of peek at how Vincent Van Gogh's artwork was dramatically transforming in a short amount of time. So the relationships that he did have supplied him with models that with compositions too that he could go back to again and again and again. This was the wife of one of his friends, his postmaster, and this is a scene that obviously he returns to several times. The painting is called La Berceuse, which is like essentially like a lullaby, because this woman is holding onto a rope, and the rope would have been attached to a cradle, so she is like rocking a baby to sleep, even though she doesn't necessarily look like the most maternal woman here with her, green face in some of these pictures. But as you can see with this assemblage here, Van Gogh is trying out color theory, trying out patterns. And of course, all of these works, modern day museums are like, scrambling to acquire. And I sort of leave it to you which one of these paintings you think is the best or most representative of what Vincent Van Gogh is capable of. I know which one I would choose if I had my own museum, that's for sure. It might be that one. So one other really important relationship that provided a model for Vincent Van Gogh was his doctor, Dr. Gachet. And Dr. Gachet, you can see from these 2 painted portraits, was sort of prone to melancholy himself. He was the doctor that was going to be treating Vincent Van Gogh, looking after him really after Vincent Van Gogh left the asylum. So he's living on his own, but he's still being treated. And Vincent Van Gogh met this man and he thought, what can this guy do for me? He wrote to his brother, like, this is the blind leading the blind here. This guy's got as many problems as I have. He paints this doctor who is actually a fellow artist as well. He paints him looking sort of melancholy, and eventually the 2 really sort of solidify their relationship and come to know each other very well. Incidentally, the first version was sold at auction for the equivalent of nearly $160 million in today's money. I believe that's this version over here on the left. So Vincent Van Gogh, obviously highly collectible, but when it comes to portraits, he painted himself the most, just like his forebear in Dutch art, Rembrandt. The mirror is the cheapest model, right? So Vincent Van Gogh paints himself throughout his career. You can always tell when there's dark shadows that it's early on, but we see that signature red beard, and we begin to see him portraying himself as an artist. I love this image of him here. He actually looks so much like his 19-year-old version self here. The year is 1887. He's living with his brother in Paris. He's healthy. He's eating well. He is thriving as an artist. And we see that full face, and we see him beginning to find his voice as an artist with these short, quick brush strokes that are intentionally laid in. And we can also see him being really playful with color here too. There's like green and red stripes on his face at the same time. but he begins to dramatically change. And part of this is because he becomes a little bit untethered. Now, there's still vivid color in these pictures, but they're, I would say, much more unsettling. He almost has like war paint on his face over here with greens, big green stripes over here. And there's so much movement around his head that our sense of what is happening inside his head gets sort of shaken up here with all of this sense of energy that's swirling around him. I do really appreciate how he's laying in color on his face here. All right, so as we move along, we did see this sort of pinched portrait earlier. This is from 1889. This is the year before he passed away, but we have this kind of free-flowing, rhythmic, almost like cloud formations behind him. So there's a sense of restraint, but also a sense of freedom, kind of counterbalancing it. But by the time he is in the asylum, he's nearly unrecognizable. He looks like a different person. He's also portraying himself here as a painter, as an artist, but he doesn't look anything like his 19-year-old self. He's gaunt. His nose all of a sudden looks almost beaky. There's an intensity to his expression here, and he's using these very dark colors as well. One of his very last self-portraits, he transforms himself. He shaves off his beard. He even shows the cuts on his face. So it would be easy to not even recognize him in this last self-portrait that we see here. So quite an evolution in terms of his approach to painting and how he portrays himself. So we only have a few minutes left. So let's talk about the famous incident of the ear. How did this all happen? Well, Vincent van Gogh had a fantasy of an artist's colony in the south of France, and he really wanted to make this happen. And so his brother sort of pushed another artist into going to the south of France with Vincent van Gogh, and they stayed in this little house. It was called the Yellow House, and Vincent van Gogh painted this house. This is his depiction of it. And he thought, in this little town here, we'll get away from the big city. The big city's corrupt. We will start an artist commune, and it will be like this pure experience that is all about the art. Incidentally, Vincent's bedroom that everyone is so familiar with, that is his room inside the Yellow House. And this chair over here is blocking the door into the adjacent bedroom, which was intended for an artist. You can't even call him his friend. They barely know each other at this point. But essentially, Vincent van Gogh's brother pays Paul Gauguin to go to the south of France with his unstable brother Vincent, so that they can have at this idea of an artist colony. And these are the portraits, the self-portraits that they create and then exchange in advance of spending this time together. Now, I believe they end up spending about 9 weeks in this little yellow house. They're both very productive during that time, but they were always getting on each other's nerves. Apparently, Vincent van Gogh had no off switch. It was driving Paul Gauguin mad. So one night they get into a very big argument, and after quarreling, Paul Gauguin leaves the house, and apparently Vincent van Gogh runs after him with a razor blade in his hands, but then runs back into the house. Paul Gauguin goes back to the house the next morning. He finds Vincent bloodied. His ear has been severed. He calls the authorities, and the two of them never see each other again. Now, we even have the contemporary news that reported on this, and I have the translation here. It says, last Sunday at 11:30 in the evening, Vincent van Gogh, a painter of Dutch origin, called at brothel number 1, asked for a woman called Rachel, and handed her ... his ear, saying, guard this object with your life. Then he disappeared. When informed of the action, which could only be that of a pitiful madman, the police went the next day to his house and discovered him lying on his bed, apparently at the point of death. The unfortunate man has been rushed to the hospital. Now, there's a lot of speculation out there. What did he actually cut? Was it his earlobe? Was it his entire ear? We do have a drawing from his doctor, which shows exactly what was cut. It was almost his entire ear, although I've certainly heard different stories from different sources over the years, people that actually saw it and people that were close to him. And so Vincent van Gogh famously painted himself with the bandaged ear. And you can see that the bandaged ear has a great deal of gauze over it too, because this was quite a significant loss on his head. So incidentally, Paul Gauguin, who he never talked to again, Paul Gauguin could have had a bigger role in this than one would think. And this is the alternative theory that I'm sort of interested in. Paul Gauguin was actually a master fencer. He brought his own swords to that little yellow house. And after he left, he was living in Paris and he witnessed the beheading of a murderer and created this cup in his own, with his own self-portrait on it, with a bloodied head and a missing ear, as though he was feeling this sense of guilt, perhaps, over what happened to Vincent van Gogh. So they could have very well quarreled, and perhaps Paul Gauguin severed his ear. We'll never know, but really Vincent van Gogh's actions certainly fall in line with what we know of his other behavior from that time. This is a little peek at his room at the asylum, where he lived for about a year just following the incident with the ear. He did have bars on his window, but like I said, he had a great deal of freedom. This asylum was nearly empty while he was living there. You can see there's not a lot of signs of life. So when he was doing well, he could move about the building and the grounds with a great deal of freedom. When he first got there, he created this famous painting of the irises, and he couldn't stop working on it. He called it a lightning rod for his mental illness. And he felt like if he could just kind of keep it going, it would keep him healthy. I think it's a very romantic painting for so many people, because he has that white iris there that stands alone. And I think a lot of people think of that as a representation of himself. Now, this picture was sold at Sotheby's in 1987 for almost $54 million. And at that point in history, that was the highest price paid ever for a work of art. Can you imagine what Vincent van Gogh would have thought of that if he were alive today? So we'll wrap up with his death and his legacy. We know that Vincent van Gogh died by a gunshot wound to his abdomen. He was staying on the top floor of this little inn in a small town outside of Paris. He was being seen by his doctor at the time, and his doctor did go and visit him, because it was a long, slow, painful death. There's certainly a theory out there that that perhaps Vincent van Gogh didn't take his own life, because that was it was the wrong place to shoot yourself. Essentially, it was a painful death. The gun was never recovered, which is a strange fact in this case. There was a gun recovered recently that sort of fits the approximate location. It was recently sold at auction for several hundred millions or several hundred thousands of dollars. We don't even know if it was in fact the gun. But Dr. Guichet was there with Vincent van Gogh when he passed away. So was his brother Theo. He was able to make it. But Dr. Guichet created this last final portrait of Vincent van Gogh on his deathbed here. Now, the remarkable thing is that just 6 months later, Theo van Gogh also passed away. He was in his early 30s. I think he was just 33 years old. He died due to the effects of syphilis. But we really have Theo and his wife and his son to thank for preserving Vincent van Gogh's legacy. Here's just a quick plug for the book that puts forward the idea that maybe Vincent van Gogh was actually murdered instead of taking his own life, if that's something you want to explore. But I'll leave you with this sort of big idea. We are so familiar with Vincent van Gogh's artwork. It is a part of not just our cultural heritage, but it's a part of like our lived experience. I mean, we send postcards, we decorate our houses, we decorate our bodies with objects that he created. He brings so much joy to people to this day. That's so remarkable. And to me, it's just sad that the story of his mental illness, the story of his mutilation, is like this kind of punchline in our culture today, or shorthand for a way of referring to somebody who is not well mentally. So so that's certainly something to ponder. There's all these ways that we can engage with his work now. There was a film that was made just a few years back called Loving Vincent. It is a hand-painted animated movie. I still have yet to see it, but they hired about 125 artists to paint 65,000 frames of this movie. It took them 6 years to do it. And then, of course, there are all these Vincent Van Gogh experiences. I'm sure some of you who are with us tonight have probably had one of these immersive experiences with the floor to ceiling projections. They make me dizzy just thinking about it. And then there's the Vincent Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. I love the sunflowers in the front here. More than 2 million people a year visit this museum. It's one of the top most visited museums in the world, and the highest visited museum out of all of the museums dedicated to a single artist. These days, his paintings just fetch hundreds of millions of dollars. This picture over here was purchased I think it was done in 1889 and purchased for $123 million in today's money. It's in the collection of MoMA now. So if you go to the list of the top 10 most expensive works of art in the world, he has several objects in that list, and they add up to more than $1 billion in today's money. So this poor struggling artist who only sold one work in his life now has this outsized role in our world today, not just because of the incredible paintings that he produced and the joy that he brings so many people, but also for his struggles, his life story, and how powerful all of that was. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Vincent Van Gogh.
If anybody has questions, you are welcome to speak up or use the chat function.
That was a lot to process, I know. Caroline asked, was he colorblind? Not that I'm aware of, but now I'm sort of curious to, oh, that was a direct question or direct message, sorry. Now I'm sort of curious as to why somebody might wonder if he was colorblind. Maybe because he was so strict about using color theory that it seemed like a system to maybe correct for that. That's an interesting idea, but as far as I know, he was not colorblind.
There's a question, Angela asks, who would have wanted to murder him?
Who would have wanted to murder him? Okay, so the theory out there, oh, and I'm hearing from Caroline that that at the immersive experience, they said he was colorblind. Oh, that's interesting. I will have to look into that. Thank you for sharing that, Caroline. That's very interesting to me. So the theory out there in terms of the murder is that when Vincent Van Gogh was out of the asylum, he's living in this small town, and that he was, essentially seen as this sort of tragic kind of madman, and that there were local teenagers that were actually bothering him quite a bit. They would pick on him if they saw him, and one of those teenagers was known to sort of idolize like Billy the Kid, and he had his own sort of unreliable gun that he did have. And so there's a theory out there that Vincent Van Gogh ran into these teenagers while he was painting out in a field, and they may have accidentally shot him with this, maybe threatened him. It's an unreliable revolver. And so Vincent Van Gogh, maybe with Gauguin, says, I did this to myself. takes the full blame because he's already sort of drowning in his own sadness, and doesn't reveal the fact that somebody else might have hurt him. That's the thinking out there. But what we do know is that he picked up his easel and his canvas and he went out to paint that day. There was a lot in his letters leading up to that that seemed very hopeful. His career was kind of taking off, really. So it seems like a strange point in his life to take this action. But he was out in a field painting, and that is when he shot himself. He passed out. When he woke up, he went back to his to the room that he was renting. The authorities were called. Several people were in the room with him over the course of the next 24 hours or so, because it did take a long time for him to die. So that was another reason why people thought, well, maybe maybe this was somebody else who unintentionally shot him, because it didn't seem like something that you would do to yourself if you really wanted to just end things. A shot to the abdomen wasn't the ideal place to do that.
Are there any more questions? That's such a tragic story. I just have to get that off my chest.
Cindy asked, did his brother have any artistic talent? That's a good question. As far as I know, he wasn't an artist himself, but as an art dealer, he had a really keen sense for what was good, and he supported a lot of artists like Gauguin. In addition to paying him to go spend time with his brother, he did purchase works by Gauguin. So he had a great sensibility, which was probably why he had the forethought to save everything from Vincent Van Gogh, to keep this preservation, to preserve all of the documents. And he passed away so quickly after his brother. We really have his wife and his son to thank for preserving Vincent Van Gogh's legacy. It's pretty amazing. I mean, and without their work, like, would we even know his name today? It's kind of amazing to think that it could have kind of fallen through our fingers that way.
Are there any more comments? We have a lot of people thanking Jane for this presentation. They greatly appreciated and enjoyed it. Just that they're sending it as direct message to me. So I just want to make sure you got the message too.
Thank you. Well, I'm so glad everybody took time out of their day to join us for this. It's always a pleasure to talk about Van Gogh and to look at these images. What a treat for all of us. So thank you for spending tonight with me.
And I want to mention that the libraries have the movie Loving Vincent. At least Sargent Memorial Library has it. So if anybody wants to check it out, it's there. And first dibs if whoever reserves it. So we have 2 more talks coming up, and they are scheduled for the last Wednesday of the month. So next one is the Wednesday after Thanksgiving, and it's on Norman Rockwell's work. It's titled Merry Rockwell Christmas. So I look forward to it. I hope you are too. And then December after Christmas, December 28th, where you will have one on John Singer Sargent. And his work is also just magnificent. So I hope you will be able to join us, everybody here. You can sign up for the talk however you found this talk. You should be able to find the links to sign up for the other ones too. And so if there are no more questions, I will stop the recording, and we can all go on and enjoy our evening. But I hope we'll see everybody else, in our next talk.